Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk for a Mailbag special. This is the show where we talk general aviation for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott, and each week I hear from many of you, and often there's not enough time to include all of your emails in the weekly shows. And I've got a great collection I'd like to share with you today. Some of them are in response to episode 273, in which we talked about checklists and medicals, and some are in response to episode 257, in which we talked about the challenges facing aging pilots and some potential solutions. So if you didn't hear those episodes, you may want to check them out at aviationnewstalk.com/273 and /257. And before we get to our first emails, I've got a couple very quick audio clips. This one was recorded on the tower frequency at Palo Alto Airport just a couple of days ago. It kind of cracked me up.
Harrison, Papa Alpha left at the end all the way to Zulu, and if you could pass along a base and tops if you remember the ground, I'd appreciate it.
Unfortunately, I don't remember. I was trying to recall, but the mind is blank.
It's no problem.
Well, there's an honest answer from that King Air pilot. And yes, I understand that. After your land, sometimes you just don't remember stuff, especially if you've been flying in hard IFR, as this gentleman had been doing. Now, here's a recording that occurred just a day or two ago, and I've got to tell you his background. I've mentioned on the show that I've taken a few helicopter lessons. Well, good news is I actually soloed for the first time just 2 days ago. Very exciting. I posted on Facebook that this was, frankly, my first solo in 50 years. I first soloed back in 1973 in a Cessna 150, and I soloed again this week in a Robinson R44 helicopter. Very exciting, and I posted video from that first solo for Patreon supporters, so check that out. And I then soloed again on the following day, and after I landed, the tower gave me a call, and I got to tell you, I was a little worried when they say, "Hey, helicopter 4040, are you still on frequency?" Because I was afraid maybe I had screwed up, but here's what it sounded like.
Helicopter 4040, you still up?
Affirmative.
Just want to say I'm a big fan of the podcast. Glad to hear you over here in helicopters.
Oh, thanks so much. I enjoy doing the podcast. Thanks for listening.
Of course.
Well, what a pleasant surprise that was to find out that the controller is a fan of the show. And I haven't told many people that I've been taking helicopter lessons, so he just happened to recognize my voice. I called him up on the phone afterwards to find out who he was, and I'd like to give a big shout out to Tim. He said that he first Googled for aviation podcast a number of years ago and found us that way. He got out of the FAA Academy in Oklahoma City about 6 years ago, and he spent all those 6 years working at the Hayward Tower, which he said he likes because it's got a really good mix of traffic. And he said when I went out the first time, he thought, that voice sounds like it could be Max, but I'm not sure. But then the second time I went out, he thought, yep, that's definitely him. So anyway, that was fun. And I'll be talking more soon about what it's like to fly a helicopter. Here's our first email that comes from Patreon mega supporter Jim Goldfuss. He says, "Hey Max, just listened to your last podcast on checklist errors. With the checklist items being missed, I thought back to the Delta 727 crash at Dallas-Fort Worth. The crew definitely did not follow a sterile cockpit. I remember the call out when the captain prompted flaps from the checklist, and the co-pilot responded rapidly, 1515 green lights. They determined he responded too quickly to have actually visually checked. But I also bring out another issue from this accident that I share with my students, and that's expectation bias. For years, I'm sure this co-pilot had run that checklist, and the flaps have always been down. Complacency does take over, but what can also happen is when something is always correct, you expect to see it, to the point that at a quick glance, instead of processing what is really showing, you see what you expect to see. That's why, particularly in instrument flying, I tell my students to speak out loud when flying approaches. You add a second sense, hearing, which helps visually process. And by speaking aloud, airspeed 90 and stable, sync rate 500 feet PM and stable, 1,200 feet for 620, etc., it forces my students to verbalize what they see and spend just a second or so more looking at the instruments to let the indication actually sink in. I'm sure many a gear up landing was preceded by the pilot in his or her head looking at the gear handle and lights and saw it down in 3 green during that quick and silent check, which in fact neither was true. The mind is a powerful co-pilot, usually good, but can be mischievous if you don't mind it and stay on your toes. Jim, thanks so much for your email. And yes, I am a talker. I am always talking aloud when I am landing or when I am flying an instrument approach. And in fact, I'll talk a little bit later about my first helicopter solo, which occurred earlier this week. And I was doing exactly that. I shot some video, and you can see me talking about the various speeds and descent rates and corrections I'm making and things like that. So I think that's a very powerful technique for pilots to follow. And here's an email from a gentleman who wishes to remain anonymous, also about checklists. He says, I wanted to thank you for your recent show on checklists and checklist-related accidents. I've had an issue or two with this myself, and I wanted to share. I learned on an SR20 for my private and purchased an SR22 a year ago. In fact, it's in for the annual right now, which is why I'm typing this message instead of playing in the sky. I did my training for the instrument rating on the 22, but none of my instructors ever really preached checklist diligence much at all. We'd go through the pre-flight carefully and then the run-up, but that was about it. Everything else was just remember to lean the mixture or a variety of other things that you just had to think of. On more than a few occasions, I'd land and notice that I hadn't turned on the fuel pump or that the mixture was still lean. I'd get really annoyed with myself, but never thought to get more diligent with the checklist because it seemed to me to be a pre-flight thing. Well, the DPE for my IFR check ride felt quite a bit differently. When I showed up to the test, he warned me, quote, I'd better see you going through the checklist at every stage of flight. I felt the blood run out of my face and knew that I had a rough ride in front of me. I briefly contemplated bagging it and apologizing for wasting his time, but I decided to give it a shot. Well, he picked up on the fact that I was not in the habit of using checklists very quickly, and I missed several of them. I failed that day and went home with my tail between my legs. But before I left, I mentioned that I had a reasonably nice simulator at home. It's one of the pre-made Cirrus cockpit mock-ups using X-Plane and a wraparound display, though it's not an AATD. He stared at me for a few seconds and said, That's perfect. Do a flight on that sim every single day and use the checklist at every stage of flight. After you land, make note of anything you may have forgotten, then do it again. Put a big sticky note between the PFD and MFD to remind you, but you need to make this pure habit so that you don't have to think about it. Call me once you're using the checklist out of pure habit, and I'll fit you back into my schedule immediately. So that's what I did, and I passed the test on the second visit. But now I use the sim for habit building rather than just playing pilot for fun. If I have an actual flight planned and the weather isn't cooperating, or if the airplane is in for an annual, I'll do it on the sim instead. But literally I'll go through every step, including every NOTAM, checking for TFRs, checking weather at the destination, running the weight and balance, calculating takeoff and landing distances, and everything else. By doing this, I have found that these formerly tedious tasks become routine and almost comforting, and I don't have to burn thousands of dollars in 100 low-lead to change bad habits. Since that wake-up call, I've been a bit of an evangelist for both checklists and for using simulators to build the right habits. Oh, and I can't remember the last time I landed with a lean mixture or the fuel pump on. Sometimes I don't even remember running the checklist, but when I look, everything's configured as it should be for that stage of flight. So I know I did it out of habit and barely had to think about it. Whether or not that's a good thing is certainly food for thought, but I'll take it over the alternative. Thanks for the great show, Max. Well, Anonymous, thank you so much for sending this. And he said that he wanted his name withheld because he didn't want to be throwing any of his instructors under the bus who might be listening. I have often been asked about the value of using a simulator for student pilots. Now, most of the time simulators get used for instrument flight training, but I have often said that one of the best ways to use it as a student pilot is to drill your procedures, practice your checklist, practice the many different steps you need when you're landing or performing maneuvers. And I think this really paid off for this gentleman. So thanks so much for sharing that. And here's an email from Mega supporter Drew Anderson. He says, I wanted to thank you for your recent episode on checklists. It prompted me to compare the checklist that I downloaded off the internet with the POH. I'm ashamed to say that I didn't do the comparison immediately. There were a few changes that had to be made. Additionally, I have returned to using my checklist after a flow to confirm that I've completed the flow properly, such as in cruise and before landing. My checklist has always included lean engine for taxi. I know this has helped me avoid plug fouling. I have failed 2 mag checks that have been resolved after leaning the engine for a minute or two during run-up. Thank you for all you do. I'm proud to be a Mega supporter. It's not an overstatement to say that the Aviation News Talk podcast matters and saves lives. And by the way, I mentioned a few weeks ago when Drew became a new supporter that we would tell you more about him on a future show. And just want to let you know he's a dermatologist who flies a glass panel Piper Cherokee 235 out of the Anderson, Indiana airport. And he's working on his instrument rating and looking to buy a Cirrus in the future. And here's an email from Jeff Uter. He writes, "Hi, Max. I just listened to episode 233 where you talked about the importance of following checklists and also recommended making your own. This struck a chord with me as making my own checklist was probably the most helpful thing for me in learning the flows across my private and instrument ratings. Oddly enough, I'd never met anyone else who did this, and my CFI said I was the only student she had who did this as well. I find it odd considering that building your own checklist is a great way to read and absorb the POH, and at least for me, provides a better format for workflows and organizing other relevant information that normally isn't on the standard checklist. I'd like to direct you and your listeners to flightchecklists.com, a newly created website that allows anyone to easily create their own individual custom checklist for free. Now, I will mention that they also have paid versions of those checklists as well, because I did go out and visit their website. He says, please note, I received no benefit from your listeners visiting the page. I just happened to be chatting with a designer on social media about custom checklists, and I agreed to beta test the site to help out. I used Adobe InDesign to create my own custom checklist just because I like to dabble in design products. But if this website existed when I was first learning how to fly, I would have used it instead, as it's far easier and just as capable for this purpose. Thanks for all you do for the show." Well, there you have it. A couple of different people who recommend making your own checklist. And I mentioned in a prior show that that's one of the first things I did when I started taking helicopter lessons earlier this year. And now here are a couple emails from people who are commenting on episode 257 back in December, which was on aging pilot challenges and solutions, in which we talked to Dr. Victor Vogel. From Patreon supporter Adam Gropper, he says, "Hi, Max. Glad to support you. I've been listening for a while and get a lot out of it. Got my private 18 years ago in a 172 with round gauges and quit at around 120 hours. Was too busy and frankly was pretty nervous flying cross countries by myself. Last year I decided to try it again, so I've been doing a Cirrus SR20 transition and complete private pilot review. They are just about ready to turn me loose after 25 flight hours and untold tens of hours studying. By the way, I think that's about the right ratio. Got to do a lot of study on your own in addition to flight training." He continues, "Also just passed my IFR knowledge test, so going straight into that. Your show keeps me caught up on GA and is a constant reminder that we need to always be learning and have safety in the front of our minds. Keep up the great work. I was particularly interested in the effects of aging episode. At age 60, I definitely feel slower both in reaction time and effort to absorb and retain information. It was a bit of a reality check, and flying has tested me in ways that I have not been tested since I got my private. In fact, after the first 5 hours or so, I seriously questioned whether I could or even should start flying again. I've gotten much more comfortable the more knowledge and experience I've gotten, but it's still an open question. I figure if I can get through instrument, then I'm probably capable, so I guess we'll see." And I wrote back to him, "Congratulations on getting back into flying after so many years. I've worked with multiple people who had 30-year gaps in their flying, and it's definitely a lot of work to help them get spun back up and proficient in an airplane. And I'm glad you enjoy the effects of aging episode. You may have seen in a Patreon post that I did recently that episode inspired me to work on getting a helicopter certificate. It's been a fun challenge, and I'm enjoying the hard work of sinking my teeth into something new that requires a lot of mental work. I think working on your instrument rating now makes a lot of sense, because in the process of working on it, you'll be brushing up on so many other aspects of flying. When I started my instrument rating, I combined it with a checkout in a new aircraft type. Since I was going to spend so many hours in the plane anyway, I figured that combining it with a new rating was a more cost-effective way of achieving both goals. And thanks so much for being a Patreon supporter of the show." Now here's another email that I got, which was completely anonymous. No name, no email, no way to reply. And by the way, you can always include your name and just say, please don't mention it. But this was the first one that I had no way to reply at all. He said, "I heard a show of yours a while back about the aging pilot. It got me thinking. I recently hit 60 years of age and took early retirement from my airline job. It was a great career, but after 33 years, I think I'd had enough of flights across the ocean in the middle of the night." By the way, I'll just add, a friend of mine used to fly 767s for Google, and she said the same thing. Flying across the Pacific all night got a little tiring, and she also retired. He continues, your show made me reconsider my future in aviation. I benefited greatly from being in the airline system in that I continually had a critical eye on my performance. You made me realize that this will end as I depart the airline system. Over the years, I did wonder if and hope that I'd have someone with the courage to tell me if I was losing my marbles and should best hang up my flying hat. After listening to your show, I decided I need to take the initiative on this, so I sold my plane and have hung up my flying hat while I'm still able to pass a check without issues. Your show made me realize I'd rather go out on top rather than succumb to the many threats you rightly pointed out. So thank you for that. I will have fond memories of my flying career and can enjoy it from a distance. Well, I have a couple of thoughts on that. And first of all, I think it makes total sense for all of us as pilots to kind of plan how we're going to gracefully exit flying. This gentleman has made a good choice that works for him. And I recall a story of a local aircraft broker at my home field telling us about a pilot who was in his 80s who continued flying his 182 long after he should have. Now, I don't remember all the details, but I do recall that there were multiple incidents on the ground where it became clear that this pilot was forgetting to do basic things and was no longer a safe pilot. Eventually, someone apparently told him that he needed to stop flying, but it's clear this gentleman stayed in flying way past the point where he should have been. Now, by contrast, I flew with a lady pilot who figured out a very graceful way to throttle back her flying activities. She owned a Cessna 182 that she and her husband purchased brand new 50 years earlier. Now, she was also a flight instructor, and so I think having flown with other pilots, that probably gave her some insight on how to continue flying safely as she got older. She told me that she initially gave up instrument flying and later only flew VFR. Later, she stopped flying at night and only flew in the daytime. Now, I used to give her a flight review every 2 years for many years, and I gave her her last one when she was 92 years old. Now, in that flight, she was worried that she had somehow lost her ability to land. I dug a little deeper and asked if she'd gotten shorter as she aged. She said she had, so we went and got a cushion for her to sit on so that she could more easily see out the front window. Problem solved. She was just delighted that she could once again make great landings. Now, that was the last flight review that I did with her, and she met all the PTS standards, so I signed her off. I know that she brought in a couple of partners into the ownership of her airplane, and later on, she wouldn't fly solo, but she would only fly with one of them. Now, interestingly, I figured out why she liked to fly with me. I would often sit there silently and enjoy the beauty of our flights together. But when she flew with others, they were often talking most of the time. So we had a wonderful time together, quietly enjoying the majesty of flight. She passed away 3 years ago at the age of 101. And one of the things that helped her retain her flying skills for so long was that she flew the same plane for 50 years, which is an excellent way to develop a habit pattern that could last a lifetime, even as she slowed down in old age. So she's always been a model for me on how to gracefully throttle back one's flying activities as we age. So that's something that you'll want to give thought to at some point. And here's an email from patron supporter Bob Luton. He writes, I listened to episode 273 to your comments regarding your preparation for your latest Class 2 FAA medical certificate. You described the procedure of pre-obtaining a letter from your primary care physician regarding your blood pressure medication and the fact that the letter included a blood pressure reading within the last 90 days. I did the exact same procedure the last time I applied for a third-class FAA medical. The AME rejected the letter from my physician because it failed to state that I was not experiencing any side effects from the blood pressure medication. The AME put my Class 3 application on hold until I made another appointment with my primary care physician and included the no side effects wording into the revised letter. I then went back and presented the new letter to the AME and was promptly issued my third-class medical certificate. Be forewarned if you happen to encounter a by-the-book AME. Well, thanks so much for that, Bob. And yes, my key point was it makes a lot of sense to prepare for your FAA medical. And here's an email from patron supporter Richard Green. He writes, I'm listening to episode 273 and can relate to your recent FAA medical. Preparation is key. My wife has a heart condition that required open heart surgery. I went with her to the consult with a surgeon for support. As the surgeon was explaining what exactly she intended to do, I fainted. I was wheeled into the emergency department, and after a few tests, the doctor there declared that I was fine and likely overwhelmed by the moment. I was referred to a cardiologist for further evaluation. knowing that I need to declare this loss of consciousness event to the FAA and that an unexplained loss of consciousness is cause to revoke a medical certificate, I found the protocol or battery of medical tests the FAA would want to see in making a certification decision. I went to the cardiologist. I requested he ordered, and more importantly, the insurance company paid for the FAA's battery of tests. There is nothing wrong with my heart. About 3 months before my medical was due to expire, I went back to the AME with the results of the test and a letter from my wife's surgeon explaining what happened in her exam room. I fully expected to be deferred. The AME reviewed the test results, made a phone call to the regional air surgeon, notated my file in MedExpress, and issued me a medical certificate. The moral of the story, just like a check ride, preparation is key. Well, Richard, thanks so much for sharing that story, and hopefully both you and your wife are doing fine. And here's an email from patron supporter Patricia Burris. She says, I loved your episode on P-static, or precipitation static. I didn't know what caused that sound, having never experienced it until a year ago. It happened in IMC getting vectored for massive thunderstorms at flight level 230 in our Cirrus SR20T over the Atlanta Bravo heading to KCAE with a zillion people trying to get into every nearby airport for the Masters besides the usual KATL traffic. We were without any ability to hear for several minutes. We finally decided to rely on our training, Squawk 7600, and slowly start down to our final destination. Another couple of minutes passed and we were able to start hearing some voices amongst the shrieking. Within the next minute, we could finally hear again and promptly made a call. We were greeted with a hearty welcome, November 123 Alpha Bravo. Then no instructions followed. We got a new controller who then told us in no uncertain terms to immediately stop our descent. We ultimately had to get vectors out north of CAE to scrub thousands of feet of altitude to get down to the field, but we made it in on the approach without further incident just before the rain started coming down. It was an unforgettable trip. Oh, and our beloved UT Longhorn alumnus, Scotty Scheffler, won too. Well, that's great. Glad you learned about precipitation static, and we talked about that in episode 265 for anybody who wants to go back and listen to that. And here are a couple emails regarding spatial disorientation that we talked about in episode 272 when we talked about 3 recent accidents. This first one comes from Sam Dawson. He says, another very good show referencing the cinematographic illusion over the water. The FAA Chief Counsel has actually said that night flying conditions with no illumination or discernible horizon over the water can be logged as instrument conditions. When I taught in El Paso, Texas, I made it a part of both private and instrument flying to take students up on a moonless night so they could see this flying over the desert. It was very easy to induce an unusual attitude in such conditions. Yeah, and Sam, I think it's no wonder that we continue to have spatial disorientation accidents over the water. People just don't seem to understand how disorienting it can be when it's totally dark outside. And here's an email from Adam in Missouri. He says, I love the last podcast about the 2 recent night incidents. It made me think about why we in the U.S. don't adopt a more international approach to night flying and have a separate night rating, which, by the way, is what they have in Canada. If you get your private, it doesn't include night privileges. You have to do additional training for that. He wrote, I got my private just outside of Raleigh, North Carolina at KTTA. Most of our time was after work, and I had almost triple the 3-hour requirement for night instruction. I think of this as being a lot like the 3 hours of instrument flying. It is an introduction to make sure you understand at least some of the hazards to help give you the skills to get out of trouble if needed. I really didn't understand the cinematographic illusion until I was working on my instrument rating. I moved to Missouri and started training out of KJEF. Later in my instrument training and after the time change, I went up with my instructor to get my night currency back. We did a stop and go, and right after we rotated, I lost all references. I got a strong feeling like I was tumbling backwards. I knew about cinematographic illusion from your episode 157, but was surprised by how powerful the sensation was. If it hadn't been late into my instrument training, I don't know if I would have immediately transitioned to instruments. I think one of the reasons I never felt this illusion during my private could have been my proximity to a bigger city. I can see how the 3-hour requirement could really be a trap. I can see how a low-time pilot, like myself, could take off on a night cross-country to an airport they hadn't been to at night and get into trouble without the training to overcome such a powerful sensation. I appreciate all the podcasts and learn a lot from them. I hope to start supporting Aviation News Talk soon, but have been dumping all my extra money into flight time. Thanks for all of your hard work. Well, Adam, thanks so much. And I think you have a lot of keen insights. I've often thought that we might be better off not giving 3 hours of instrument training as a private, because that way people would know for sure that they absolutely have to stay out of a cloud. And yet I think people who take the 3 hours of instrument training as a private may think that they will be safe if they were to blunder into a cloud with their 3 hours of instrument training. But let me point out, that's less than 10% of the training required for the instrument rating. So sometimes I worry that it may do more harm than it actually does good. But anyway, I think you've got some keen insights there, Adam, and thanks for sharing them. And patron supporter Daryl Contreras says, "Hi, Max. I was happy to finally support the show after getting so much out of your podcasts. This has been a long time overdue. I have enjoyed the content so much, and it was very helpful to me in 2022 when I completed my CFI and MEI check rides. I'm now working on my CFII. I live in the Fort Worth area, and my day job as a compliance officer keeps me busy, but I enjoy teaching and flying. I found flight instructing to be quite enjoyable, and it has really improved my skills and awareness as a pilot. Thank you for a great podcast." Here's an email from patron supporter Greg Zurcher. He says, "Happy to support your show. It was overdue. And yes, I heard you read my message on episode 270. In fact, my whole family heard it because I played it for them a few times." He says, "I'll message you later at some point after I take my instrument check ride. Thanks for getting me introduced to Seth Lake, as I've been going through his videos in preparation for my check ride. He's got really good stuff, and I love hearing from a DPE's perspective." Well, Greg, glad to hear that you're punishing your family by making them listen to the show multiple times. No, seriously, I'm happy that you did that, and now you have even more incentive to finish your instrument rating so that I can read your name again into the good news section and you can dazzle your family again. And here's an email from patron supporter Nathan Ballard. He says, "Hey, Max, I look forward to your contents every week and share with everyone I know, especially CFIs. I made a video about the things successful CFIs do, and I, of course, had to mention listening to you and Aviation News Talk. Your stories, guests, and the experiences you share with us weekly really help to keep us all safer in the skies. Thank you again for all you do." And he gave me a link to his video, which is on YouTube, and I'll include that link in the show notes. And here's an email from patron supporter Avi Ben Menahem. He says, "Hi, Max. With warmer weather coming, I'm planning a flight that will require tabs fuel on my SR22 due to weight and balance. Doing fuel planning and planning climb rates, I found it difficult to get accurate numbers, as the POH assumes climb at full power and VY. In reality, after 1,000 feet AGL, we transition to en route climb at 120 knots, and due to CHT temperatures, sometimes even faster airspeeds. How do you approach planning when the POH numbers are incomplete?" Well, I wrote back to him and said, "Avi, you raised an interesting question. I'm not sure I have a great answer for it. When I'm flying, the most important field that I'm looking at is the FOD, or fuel on board at destination. I always try to keep that number in an SR22 around 20 gallons, which would be just over 1 hour of fuel. Of course, if you fly an older Avidyne aircraft, I don't believe that field is available. One thing you might consider, depending upon the aircraft, is a lean of peak climb at 130 knots. This will save you 5 gallons between 0 and 18,000 feet. Another thing you might do is figure out how many minutes it would take you to get to cruise altitude at VY. Then estimate how many additional minutes it would take you to get there climbing at 120 knots. If, for example, it takes an extra 5 minutes, you can calculate how many extra gallons you're going to burn based upon your average fuel flow in the climb. For example, for a normally aspirated SR22, I'd expect to burn about 27 gallons per hour in the climb. An extra 5 minutes of that fuel burn rate is just 2¼ gallons. I hope this helps." And here's an email from Landon in Tennessee. He says, "Hey, Max, there's lots of easy-to-find information about tech routes. That would be tower en route control. But the hardest part to find is an explanation of how ATC would refer to a tech route. By the way, the vast majority of these are found in Southern California, and what they basically do is provide IFR routing between pairs of different cities." He continues here, "For instance, something like the CSTP4 would be read to the pilot as the Coastal Papua 4, as I understand it, but in all the documents I haven't been able to find a breakdown of the explanation of tech route titles, so pilots would be better prepared to actually decipher what clearance they've been given. Am I making this harder than it is? Some of the tech route titles don't follow standard phonetic alphabet nomenclature I've found, and this adds to the confusion. Any tips?" No, I gotta say, Landon, I too have been confused on the very rare occasion where I have been assigned one. I remember coming out of San Luis Obispo and being assigned something like the Santa Barbara 27 and had no idea what the heck they were talking about. And of course, that was a tech route. So anyway, if any listeners have any tips as to how to better decipher the titles of tech routes, please let us know. And here's an email from Mega supporter Tim Delaney. He says, my wife and I were planning to fly to Palm Springs today for a week at our timeshare. The forecast was a bit too much since there were isolated thunderstorms in my way. Being IMC with ice, plus having to deal with boomers, was just not something I wanted to do. So we planned to go tomorrow, weather permitting. As I was pondering, all I heard in my head was, what would Max Truscott do? Well, Tim, I got to tell you, I had one of those stories just about a week ago. I was flying with a client in a SR20 at the Livermore Airport, and while we were in the pattern at altitude, the low oil pressure light came on, and I thought, whoa, I have never seen that in flight before. That's always been on the ground. So we put it back on the ground, we climbed out, and we had lots of oil still in the engine, couldn't find any leaks anywhere. And I was thinking, oh man, we are just 19 miles away from home. I could probably make it back. And it's that word probably, which is a red flag for me. And I thought, how would we explain ourselves if the engine quit and we had to pull the parachute? We'd explain that, well, yeah, we had a low oil pressure warning, but yeah, we thought we could probably make it. Well, that made the decision pretty easy. We left the airplane on the ground. We got an Uber, and mechanics came out a day or two later to take a look at the airplane. So anyway, great story. Thanks so much for sharing that. And here's an email from patron supporter Trevor Moody. He says, Max, I hope you are well. It sounds like you're doing a lot of Vision Jet flying. And I'll just add, yes, I leave on a commercial flight tomorrow to fly to Tennessee, and I'll be teaching for an entire week. So I'll be gone Saturday through Friday teaching the Vision Jet. Anyway, continuing, he says, in case you haven't seen this, I'm attaching an update to the Burley, Idaho airport diagram in the Jeppesen approach plates. They have added an interesting note that's a sad footnote to the tragic crash reported on in April 2022. By the way, we reported on that in episodes 230 and also 233, which was about a Cessna 208 Caravan that crashed after flying through a plume of steam on final to the runway there. He says, it's a good reminder that approach plate notes such as these are there for a reason, and we disregard them at our peril. On a lighter note, this attachment does reveal that I am one of the few and the proud that still subscribes to Jeppesen paper charts. I love my iPad charts as much as anyone, but I still find it useful to spend a few minutes each month updating my paper charts and seeing what changes have been made at airports in my region. I've also been meaning to let you know that I recently received my AGI certificate. That would be the Advanced Ground Instructor. He says, I'm happy to have done that really tough check ride, smiley face, and am now focused on my CFI. Thank you for continuing to produce aviation news talk with such great content and guests. I look forward to it every week. And he's sent along the chart, and it says, caution, runway 20 arrival due to numerous 80-foot steam stacks located north of the airport / Snake River at the GEM processing plant. That's the name of the potato processing plant. Exercise extreme caution on arrival, especially in poor visibility. And of course, he was joking about the check ride for his AGI certificate. To get an Advanced Ground Instructor certificate, it's really easy. You take 2 written exams, the Advanced Ground Instructor exam and the FAA exam, and then you take the test results for those 2 exams down to your local FSDO, and they will issue you a Ground Instructor certificate. And here's an email from Greg Holbrook. He writes, at episode 237, a listener asked about a whining sound while flying his 182 in IMC in light rain. I fly a 1980-172, and I too have heard a high-pitched whine when flying in light rain. No idea why. I'd be interested to know if anyone has an answer. Well, there are 2 people now. We're still looking for an answer, so go ahead and send me an email if you have any ideas. The easy way to contact me is just go to aviationnewstalk.com, and at that website at the very top of the page, click on Contact, and you can enter your information into the contact form there. And here's a really short email from Greg Johnson. He says, where can I buy that song at the end of your broadcast? Well, that, of course, is the go-around song, which I love because I trying to plant that seed in your mind to just remember anytime you get in a situation where, maybe it doesn't make sense to land, you'll just be automatically primed to go around. And in fact, today, when I did my second helicopter solo, I did do a go-around. When I was doing my second helicopter solo, I was a little bit fast, and I just thought, probably makes sense to go around. I actually said to the tower, can I go around? And he said, you can always go around when you're cleared to land. So to answer your question, if you go into our show notes, it says down at the bottom, go around song used by permission of Ken Dravis. You can buy his music at kendravis.com. So that's KenDravis.com, or take a look for that in our show notes. And I'd like to take a moment to mention a few heroes of mine. These are the roughly 4% of listeners who take the time to join the club and support the show, and I'd like to invite you to do that same thing. Join the club and help support Aviation News Talk. We've got 2 new mega supporters this week. These are people who donate $50 a month and more, and after 2 months, I'll send them a copy of one of my books. They include Rob Parisian, who added his pledge up to $50 a month. He's an orthopedic surgeon who flies out of KCON in Concord, New Hampshire. And Miles Tedder has also joined us as a mega supporter. He says, I've been working on my instrument rating over the last few months. Also, I just bought a new to me 2020 Cirrus SR20 G6. I only wish life had allowed me to start flying earlier in my life. Thanks for all the information you provide each week. You're very welcome, and thanks so much for supporting the show. And we've got some other new supporters at various levels. Thomas Zigier added his pledge up to $35 a month, so he gets access to my online courses. And at the $20 a month, the new supporters are Adam Messer and John Larrabee, so they get access to my videos, and they will have just seen my solo helicopter video that I posted. And at the $8 a month level, our thanks to Mike Collins, Tyson John Anderson, and John Grulich, who are all members of the show. If you would like to take the 2 or 3 minutes to sign up and become a member to support the show, just head on out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, since you're all awesome listeners, and you'll find ways that you can enter your credit card and support the show at whatever level that you feel comfortable with. Or if you'd like to make a one-time donation, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal, where you can make either a one-time or a monthly donation. Thanks so much to all of you who support the show. And yes, there's that song from Ken Dravis. Keep it in mind the next time you fly. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up, and remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around if it don't look right coming down. Don't wait until your side is maybe sliding upside down. You can always